My name is Ev Schmidt, and on behalf of Axiom Conferences and Robin and Cody Johnson, I would like to welcome you all here this evening to the Seattle Dialogue, a quest beyond the limits of the ordinary. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake is one of the world's most innovative biologists and is best known for his theory of morphic fields and morphic resonance, which leads to a vision of a living, developing universe with its own inherent memory. This morphogenetic field proves that the sages were right. We are all connected as one. His books, The Sense of Being Stared At and Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, detail his findings. In 2005, he was awarded the Parrott Warwick Research Scholarship by Trinity College at Cambridge University. Dr. Bruce Lipton is an internationally recognized authority on bridging science and spirit. He is the author of best-selling The Biology of Belief and teaches that when you realize that you are creating a specific field of energy around you according to the different thoughts and emotions you're experiencing, you are on the road to taking control of the things you find in your life. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to put your hands together and help me welcome Dr. Bruce Lipton and Dr. Rupert Sheldrake.
Well, I figured I'd start this off because this is a conversation that's been about 17 years in the process of getting to. I have a letter here that I just showed Rupert that he wrote to me back in May 1989. Back then I didn't have to use this, so it's a little different today. And I had sent Dr. Sheldrake a copy of a thesis on liquid crystal consciousness. And I figured I have to send it to somebody who was thinking bigger than the people I was working with at Stanford at the time. They didn't even want to talk about this stuff. And so I was really absolutely delighted and surprised that actually he wrote back that he even read it. So I got real excited and saved this letter for 20 years now. And he writes, Dear Bruce Lipton, Dickie passed on to me a copy of your essay on liquid crystal consciousness, which I've read with much interest. That was already a good start. And then he says, I like your evocation of the dynamic resonant qualities of the cell membranes. You make a good case for this integrative role, and this is convincing. The rest of it, well, some of my things weren't that clear, apparently, so I stopped reading at that part because that was the good part. But now we have a chance to talk about it. It's only been 17 years, so I appreciate this wonderful opportunity, Rupert.
Well, so do I. And although we've met a couple of times before, we've never really had a chance to talk. So this is really our first opportunity, and I'm really pleased it's happened. And in case you're wondering whether we've spent the afternoon going through the real conversation before we meet here, the answer is no. I flew in just a little while ago on a float plane from Canada. And so actually this is the conversation. So I was, when I got your letter and when I read your stuff, Bruce, I was very excited, in fact, because there are not many biologists who think outside the box. And it was a small number then, and I would say it's an even smaller number now.
Absolutely, but the company is wonderful, so I appreciate that very much.
Yes. Well, the way I saw it really was that having read some of your more recent things and looking at and seen one or two of your presentations, both of us started from biochemistry and molecular biology. When I was working in developmental biology, I got very interested in the idea of organizing fields, morphogenetic fields, which organize living systems, as it were, from the top down. You've made a really detailed and thorough study of the molecular mechanisms and the nature of membranes, quantum tunneling processes, and so on. So your approach seems to me more from the bottom up, at least when you're dealing with cells. Of course, once you're dealing with belief, you're dealing with very high level.
Past the membrane quite a bit.
Yes,
yeah.
It seems to have leaped far beyond the membrane, yes. But your stuff on membranes I find extremely congenial because I was always convinced. I had a rather eccentric professor at Cambridge who, in the tutorial system there, which when I was at Clare College, I had one-on-one tutorials with this guy. Brilliant scientist, Professor Neville Wilmer, he was called. His particular obsession was membranes. And so week after week, I got these theories of membranes from Professor Wilmer. I later discovered that nobody else really appreciated quite what he was saying. But
it was interesting, just so that people will know this, because I was at the time working on it, that most people in my field were looking at membranes like saran wrap that held the cytoplasm together and basically didn't do very much more than that. So this was a completely off base in a sense of conventional thinking.
Yes. Well, I was sort of raised by an unconventional thinker without knowing it. And so his thing was, he worked with a small unicellular organism called Naegleria. And Naegleria lives on bacteria, and it goes around like an amoeba, engulfing things. But if you change the ionic balance, raise the proportion of potassium ions in its environment, it completely changes. Its shape changes, it grows a flagellum, and it becomes a flagellated organism and swims around with a flagellum. And then if you change it back, it changes back again. And he showed me very convincingly, this is the same genes, it's got the same nucleus, it's got the same genetic instructions, and yet its membrane can be organized in two totally different ways. He then went on to show that most cells in our own bodies fall into these two main categories. One lot are more like amoebas, the other lot are more like ciliated cells with flagella. The two most extreme examples being egg and sperm cells. But even in our mucous membranes, we've got the ones that secrete the mucus and the ciliated cells that carry it along. So different cell types with the same DNA have totally different patterns of membrane organization. It's the membrane organization that's the key. So I would lap this stuff up. I was completely convinced by Wilmer. And then I discovered no one had heard of his theories, or not many people. And so when I found your paper, I thought, at last, here's somebody else who's got this rather holistic view of membranes. It's not all just DNA and proteins.
Well, for me, it was a real exciting part of my life because, as Rupert talked about, I came from the conventional world. I was teaching in a medical school, conventional story about how DNA controls life, the central dogma, the belief of our being genetic automatons. And what got me really into this was that I was working on cloning stem cells. And it's interesting because today we talk about stem cells, some hot new thing that just came out. And my first stem cell cultures were in 1967. And I was cloning these stem cells. And what that meant was I'd start with a single cell and then let it isolate it and then let it divide, and it would create a colony of several thousand cells, all genetically identical. And so what I found was something very, very similar, is that if I took these cells and put in Petri dish A with conditions A, they form muscle. But if I took the same genetic cells and put them in another Petri dish with a different environment, they started to form bone, or even a third dish with a different environment, they started to form fat cells. And here I am in the middle of this whole world based on genetics as a controlling factor of life, and I realized, well, these are all genetically identical. The only thing that changed was the environment, and the environment controlled the cells, and that led me on a track to identify how could the environment influence what we thought was genetic control. And that led me to the understanding of the membrane as this interface. And it was fun because what I was really finding is that the membrane was an intelligent mechanism. It would read what was going on in the world around it and then send information into the cell to adjust the biology to meet the demands of the world. And so why that became important is I started to recognize, well, the information that controls the cells is not in the cell. The information that controls the cells is from the outside. And then morphogenic fields came into my reading, and this was classic because of the pioneering effort to, he got out of the box big time when he wrote this book, because I realized most of my colleagues weren't going to even talk about it either, but I found there was a kindred spirit out there of seeing answers beyond what we were looking for. And I got excited. That's why I sent my work to Rupert, because I provided a mechanism by which the fields that Rupert was suggesting existed, I was showing a mechanism to convert those fields into the molecules that make biology. So it was like, I didn't have to find the fields. He brought me the fields, and I came with a membrane. It was like perfect marriage at that point.
Yes. Well, I too... It's not yet consummated, but... So I was... actually, I didn't realize that you'd started on stem cells, because when I was doing my PhD at Cambridge, I was working on tissue cultures, plant tissue cultures. And I had very much the same experience as you. The same cells, the same genetics, changed the hormonal balance and the conditions in which they're growing. And so one lot would form callus cells, just growing like wound tissue. Another lot would start forming little xylem cells, the wood cells, the ones that conduct water in plants. And you could change the destiny of these cells just by changing the chemical conditions. Somehow the membranes and the cells were responding. And in the plant, when they do this in a regular pattern that I came to the conclusion must depend on fields. How I came to that conclusion was that I made a big discovery when I was a research student. I discovered that the main plant auxin, the main plant hormone called auxin, indole acetic acid, is actually made by dying cells. As they die, the proteins break down. As the proteins break down, the tryptophan gets broken down, one of the amino acids. As that's broken down, it gives indole acetic acid. Any dying cells produce auxin. Your dying cells, my dying cells, any dying cells, I tried dying rat liver, dying yeast, dying bacteria, dying plant cells. They all produce this plant hormone. And plants are full of dying cells. Every wood cell in a plant is dead. It thickens up its cell wall, and then the cell commits suicide. It dissolves itself to produce little tubes that conduct water throughout plants. That's what wood is. It's made of these little tubes. And these cells that were dying, making the wood cells, seemed to be where the main hormone auxin was being produced. And this solved all sorts of problems in botany. It was, for me, a tremendously exciting discovery. At that time, I shared the beliefs of many of my colleagues that just understanding chemicals and where they're produced and where they move would help us understand development, because they'd switch on and off genes. I then realized, after a bit of reflection, this explained too much. All plants produce auxin. All plant tissues have these dying cells. And yet, if you take, say, a hollyhock plant, the leaves and the flowers, the petals, have completely different structures, and yet they have the same veins and the same chemicals. So the chemicals alone couldn't explain it. All plants have the same chemicals, yet they all have different shapes, and what's more, different parts of the plant have different shapes. That's what got me interested in morphogenetic fields, a concept I didn't invent myself. It was already there in the developmental biology literature since the 1920s. And interestingly, the very first description of it by Alexander Gervich in the 1920s was in relation to mushrooms. And Gervich was fascinated by the way that in mushrooms, fungal hyphae grow as single threads through the soil or through rotting wood. And then these separate threads, all growing independently, when the right moment comes, grow together, and then they form the fruiting bodies like a mushroom. How on earth did these separate threads know what to do? They're all the same to start with, but some form the cap, some form the gills, some form the stem, some form the membrane at the top, the skin. How on earth did these cells know what to do so it was harmoniously coordinated with the rest? And he came up with the idea of morphogenetic fields, fields concerned with the shaping of form, morphe, form, genesis, coming into being, fields to do with the coming into being of form. I thought a very brilliant idea, and of course I'll say more about it tomorrow, But this really led me into this whole field approach to biology. Not just him, but a whole series of biologists after him had developed this idea. So did you, in your, what stage did you come up with field ideas?
Well, when I started to, it was interesting, I was still stuck in the chemical world. And I identified that on the membrane, there are these structures called receptors. And there's an interesting parallel here, which we'll talk about again maybe tomorrow, and that is that we are made in the image of a cell, actually. So that if I talk about a cell or I talk about a human, we're still talking about the same thing. So the skin of the cell is very much similar to yours in a sense. It's a boundary that contains the inside, but it also has the ability to read the environment. So as we have eyes and ears and nose and taste and all these other receptors, cells have on them the same things but in micro form in a sense. So they're reading the environment, and the truth is, from my second grade image, when I first saw cells, I saw them as sentient beings. I didn't see them as just moving around in the water. They were like the amoeba would go look at something and then back away and then move somewhere else, or the paramecium. So I saw them as people, and it turns out to be, here's a very interesting relation, if you that we'll talk about at some point in regard to fractals, that we are made in the image of the cell. Every function that is in our human body is already present in every cell. Anything you can identify in here is in a cell. It's got digestive, respiratory, excretory, nervous, reproductive system. Every cell even got an immune system. And so the relevance that was really fun for me is that by understanding the nature of what the cells were reading in their environment, it changed their lives. And then I started to recognize this because I'm cloning these cells in a petri dish, and the simple thing that you've learned right away in culturing cells is sometimes the environment isn't that good when you culture them, and you put the cells into these cultures, and next thing you know they're sick and dying and they don't look very good. But I found if you take those cultures and then put them into a better environment, the cells immediately recover, grow, and start to flourish. And then all of a sudden it hit me, I said, oh my goodness, realize this, that well, we see ourselves as single individual entities. That's a misperception because the living things are cells. We are communities of cells, about 50 trillion cells it's been suggested, making us up. Why that's relevant is that in a simple reality, we are like skin-covered petri dishes. And if we put our petri dishes in a good environment, then we flourish and do well. And if we put it in a bad environment, we start to reflect what was going on in that environment, and that we can come back and then get back into a good environment and recover. And why this became important is, for me, it took the emphasis to understand the nature of health and vitality was to look outside of the cell and not look inside the cell, which became, to me, a physical complement of the world. So the cell becomes a complement of its environment. And so then the issue is, what is that environment? And my conventional teaching only left me in the physical world of molecules and atoms and the material world. And it was at some point after I left my conventional job that I picked up a book by Heinz Pagels called The Cosmic Code. And it was about quantum physics. I had no idea about quantum physics, really, because as a biologist, I was just lucky enough to get through physics in school. And so, but it turned out that I realized that not only myself, but every one of my colleagues was only programmed with what is called Newtonian or, classical physics, which is a world based on material reality. That they didn't understand anything about quantum physics, neither did I. But as I started to read the book, I was totally shocked because the simple truth is this: physics is the primal science. If you want to study biology, you got to know physics before you know biology. And I started to go back and I realized not only did I not know it, everyone in my field had no understanding of this physics. And the first thing the new physics said is it's not the physical reality where the information is. It's in the field, the invisible stuff. And all of a sudden it was like that jumped me from my mechanical material world idea into entertaining the concept of the invisible force as being more powerful. And then, and what it ultimately brought to me was the concept of spirituality, which I didn't believe in. And I actually got into science to avoid the spiritual stuff. And it's interesting because when you're growing up and you hear these people give all this wonderful spiritual wisdom, and then as a kid you look at their lives, and even as a kid you go, geez, well, that doesn't work for that guy very well, so why should you listen to that? And so I really went into science because I thought that's where I'm going to find all these truths to make sense out of my world. And the joke for me was, when I finally got to the awareness and I was already a tenured faculty member, I realized I was teaching religion as much as I was teaching science. And that's because we were just teaching dogmatic beliefs based on what everybody, like a show of hands. How many people want to believe in this? Oh, that's enough people, so that's a rule. And so the issue about that is that I started to realize is that we were completely misunderstanding the nature of the game, and that you cannot live in this world without understanding first the mechanisms of the quantum mechanics, which is the foundation. And it's kind of weird because that's that weird science. That's the one it's a particle, it's a wave. How can it be both? And that's the nature of the game. And yet, the moment you bring that science into this field of biology that we're talking about, all the problems that we're really basically facing in the world today start to sort themselves out in much better solutions and resolutions than the mechanical drug pharmaceutical industry answer to the issues. And it's an unfortunate situation because my perception of it now is that this has been perhaps one of the biggest destructive events in biomedicine is their collusion with pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. I found that the surprising thing for me was that while in the 20th century physics had become more open, discovering more and more weird things, quantum theory, indeterminacy, all the different wave-particle duality, quantum non-locality. In cosmology, weird phenomena like quasars, now multiple universes, all this stuff was going on. Physics getting broader and broader and stranger. In the same period, throughout the 20th century, biology has gone in exactly the opposite direction. It started broad, and it's got narrower and narrower and narrower, right through the 20th century. As when I was an undergraduate, most biology was still semi-holistic. We still looked at living animals and plants. Not much, but I mean, the first thing, you brought them into the lab, and they were alive for the first few minutes till you killed them. But they don't even have that now. My son's just been studying biology at school, at high school in England, and in his whole course, it was all molecular biology. They didn't see a single living or dead organism. They don't even dissect things anymore. It's all just learning about molecules. So I think that this extreme reductionist molecular biology thing has got worse, a lot worse, and made biology much narrower. And I saw this when I was, again, a student at Cambridge. I was studying biochemistry, and we had a series of special seminars given by molecular biologists, and I was one of a hand-picked group invited in the evenings to hang out with Francis Crick and Sidney Brenner. Both of them got the Nobel Prize, both of them eminent Cambridge biologists. And they were trying to persuade us, who they thought was this group of promising biochemists, to go into molecular biology. This was in 1963. And they explained their approach, and it was very clear. Francis Crick said, we've figured out the genetic code in 10 years. He said, we've understood the basic key to life in 10 years. There are two basic problems still unsolved, developmental biology and consciousness. He said, the only reason they haven't been solved so far is the people who are studying them just aren't smart enough. He said, I'm taking consciousness, Sidney Brenner's taking developmental biology, and we'll have it figured out in 10 years in molecular terms. They believed this. It was a kind of evangelical crusade. They then persuaded grant-giving agencies, and later in the 70s and 80s, beginning then, investment companies to invest huge amounts in molecular biology, promising that sequencing the genome, the genetic modification of plants, all this kind of thing, will lead to huge profits. And the Human Genome Project was invented as a political move. The biologists have always suffered from physics envy. And and there was a debate in the early 80s about physics has got big science, multi-billion-dollar projects like atom smashers, colliders, and so forth, as well as all the stuff they had, space programs. Biology was still a kind of cottage industry. So they wanted some big project that would capture the imagination, that you could explain. It had to be something you could explain to President Reagan. Well, that limited your... that limited the possibilities. And they came up with the Human Genome Project. You know, it was big, it's human, it's a multi-billion-dollar, it's the kind of thing that would be a milestone in history. You know, it had all the right things. It was a smart move. It then meant there was a huge amount of money, billions of dollars invested in it. Then this led to biotech companies and all sorts of... And if you have hundreds of billions of dollars invested in molecular biology, that means there's lots of jobs. If there's lots of jobs, universities have to train people for those jobs. And it swung the entire balance of biology right over to the molecular side. Universities, many of them hardly do any other biology now. So this was, I think, a deliberate thing with market forces going along with it that has led to this tremendous distortion of biology in this reductionist direction. Of course, the Human Genome Project turned out to be a big disappointment. I mean, they were expecting that we'd all have by now, you know, individualized medicine, all sorts of enormous benefits were supposed to flow. They didn't. And when the genome was finally sequenced, you know, the private genome company, Celery Genomics, that was going to patent hundreds of human genes and make lots of money out of patenting genes, headed by Craig Venter, in 2000, their shares were trading at about $230 a share. Within a few months, they were about $8 a share. They're now $7 a share. And when people actually saw the results, and when there was a tremendous anticlimax, a tremendous sense of disappointment. And I read an interview with Craig Venter, who at least has a good sense of humor. He said, "I'm a guy that's made $1 million the hard way by working my way down from $1 billion." So I think that this enormous boom in molecular biology, leading to a tremendous distortion of the whole of biology, might actually be coming to an end, because it's running into the ground. And one reason I think this is that molecular biologists are now drowning in data. They've sequenced not just the human, but dozens of other genomes. There are computer databases stacked with these huge amounts of information. It's now easy to buy machines that do this. Every issue of Nature and Science, the leading international journals, are crammed with full-page ads for sequencing machines, molecular biology, chemicals, and so forth. They just don't know what to do with it. Now they think that by hiring computer experts and calling it bioinformatics, that somehow the answer will appear. But actually, the more smart guys in that field are realizing that just piling up detailed molecular data isn't going to work.
It was a real interesting, to me it was not a disappointment, it was a total failure of the system for this reason. That a very interesting point, because Paul Silverman, one of the architects of the Human Genome Project, wrote, and I didn't know it myself because I was caught up in the field thinking, the Human Genome Project sounds like a good humanitarian kind of thing to do. And then I read what it was principled on, and it was really created by venture capitalists. Yes. And the reason for it was this. They anticipated that they were going to make a list of all the genes in the human body. And so that any defect that anybody would ever have would be some way connected to a gene. And if they could identify every one of these genes, then every one would be like a new drug that they could use to treat anybody's particular illness. And when the project got off the ground, the venture capitalists were all excited because according to the model, it would take over 100,000 genes, maybe 150,000 genes to make a human. And of course, the venture capitalists, that's 150,000 new drugs. That's why everybody jumped on the bandwagon. They were going to patent them all. In fact, I think they have patented most all of the gene segments at this point. But the failure was, and they didn't talk about it, which is always a fun part, when the results came in, there ends up to be about 21,000 genes. And why this is relevant is that some of the smallest animals on this planet have about the exact same number of genes. And so the reality, there was no difference between men and worms in this regard. And it really it just blew the bubble up because it was all, as you said, all the plans. As soon as we have this list of genes, we're going to be able to fix everybody and anybody. And then the issue was not only were there 120,000 missing genes, but then they were complete void as how can you make a human with only 21,000 genes. There was nothing even in their thinking box of where you had to get way out of the box to try to figure out how could you make a human with this. And the issue is, when you put this much money into something, it's like a steamroller going downhill, gaining this momentum, you pass the finish line that says, okay, you lost the race, and yet the power of this thing is just pushing on, and we're still buying the same story. If you pick up the newspapers about, a gene that controls this and a gene that controls that, as if like nothing ever happened. It's like, same story, just ignore the results. And the reality is, you cannot ignore the results. But there's so much money, as you said, in that genetic industry that they're trying to keep this thing afloat, and yet the model is gone.
Yes.
The model is completely gone.
I think that something that also boosted this was the whole ideology of the selfish gene. Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, came out in 1974, and it portrayed genes as selfish, ruthless, competitive. In fact, it perfectly fitted sort of Thatcherism in Britain. And this kind of right-wing, competitive, selfish type politics that glories competitiveness and aggression and stuff. And I think that also helped this process along, because it gave a kind of ideological underpinning. And it does mean that and we're going to come to the solutions tomorrow. Don't worry, this may seem a bit negative, but we have to diagnose the problem first. I saw this very clearly illustrated. I have my closest friend when I was at Cambridge as a graduate student was working on protein synthesis in the biochemistry department. He later got the Nobel Prize for his work in discovering cell cycle proteins, cyclins, proteins made when cells start dividing. He's called Sir Tim Hunt. He got the Nobel Prize in 2000 for his work on cyclins. He was invited to give a lecture at the Royal Society, London. It's Britain's National Academy of Sciences, the oldest one in the world, called the Royal Society, just the Royal Society. It was the Croonian lecture. It was once a year. He got a medal. The president was there, rows of people, eminent scientists, minister for science, everyone was there. He gave a lecture on cell cyclins, and he started with his first PowerPoint, the cyclin formed in cell dividing cells. Then you have to find out what activates the cyclin. So cyclin activase factor, and then cyclin activase factor B, and cyclin activase factor phosphorylase, and then cyclin activating factor phosphorylase. And soon, as the thing grew up, there were about 30 of these things, and all with arrows pointing to them. And this was just to do with proteins involved in the cell division cycle. The details proliferated and proliferated and proliferated until this mind-numbing slides getting more and more detail on them. We finally ended the lecture with these slides with hundreds of these interacting things. And then at the end, the president of the Royal Society, Lord May, stood up and said, well, thank you, Dr. Hunt, for that very stimulating lecture. And he said, now I think we have time for some questions. Any questions? And there was absolute silence. I mean, I've never... And then after a few minutes, embarrassing silence, a hand went up. Yes. And so this woman stood up and she said, in the cyclin activase phosphorylase B, is it more activated by magnesium or by calcium ions? He said, well, I'm glad you asked that question. We're working on that at the moment. He said, some people think more calcium, some people think more magnesium. And then there was another silence, and I thought, well, I'd better help him out. He's my oldest friend in science. And so I put up my hand, and yes. And I said, could this be, does this same system work in plants? A simple question. And he said, well, we don't yet know, some of the details the same. Anyway, that ended that. And then there was more awkward silence. And then he, to break the ice, said, well, I'm afraid nobody seems to be asking many questions. He said, and the two that have come, he said, were not exactly planted. He said, but the first was my wife, and the second... He said the second was the Antichrist. and all these heads in the front row turned around. So then there were clearly no more after that. So Lord May then had to say, well, Tim, surely there must be some simplifying principles somewhere. And he said, well, if there are, we don't know what they are. and you know, this is it. This encapsulated for me, epitomized this proliferation of molecular detail. And so I really do feel that at last there's a realization dawning within the world of molecular biology that we need to go beyond all this molecular detail. And I think that the other thing that's becoming clear to a lot of people is that the whole debate in biology is now being influenced by consciousness studies, that biologists are realizing, having left out consciousness for years, decades, centuries, it's becoming really important. And that is leading, I think, to a whole new perspective coming in, at least in relation to the brain.
Well, it is, and an interesting aspect of it is still, but you're bringing those molecular people back into the same story, so they're still trying to explain everything on the basis of the chemistry because that's all that they work with, and they're not really ready to take the jump outside of this right now, and that's an unfortunate situation because there's so much data out there, and yet here's a simple reason why we're not going there as far as I'm concerned. It goes like this. I could ask you a very simple question, and I go, are you aware that there are other kinds of more effective and more efficient ways of producing energy than fossil fuels? And almost everybody will say, yeah. And I say, so where are they? And the answer is, well, it's not in the interest of the fossil fuel industry to sell these things. Okay? Now, when it comes to biology, there's the drug company. They sell chemicals. They sell drugs. And if you come up with energy healing or, fields and invisible forces, that's completely to them is like the free energy devices for the petroleum people. They will actually stop the research in that area, take away the money, or send the skeptics to your house. Like I'm sure you must have, on Halloween, skeptics show up a lot.
Well, I've never had house visits from skeptics, but I do get a lot of abusive emails. Yeah, I think actually in relation to the health thing, it's interesting that drug companies have one set of interests, but insurance companies and socialized medicine providers have different ones. And there's an interesting debate in Britain at the moment because we have a socialized medicine system which is paid for from taxes. And of course it's getting more and more expensive. And it's very difficult for governments all over Europe where there's pretty good social welfare provisions on the whole. Do they raise taxes, very unpopular, to pay for ever more expensive medicine? Or do they somehow try and deliver it cheaper? And they're now very obsessed with what they call evidence-based medicine. What this means is that in its better forms, they do peer-reviewed study, meta-analyses, and they find that if a generic drug will have the same effect as an expensive patented one, they now put pressure on doctors to dispense the generic drug, often made in India. It's really cutting the costs. So it's not in their interest, actually, to support pharmaceutical companies to a very large degree. In Britain, we also have a certain amount of alternative medicine within the National Health Service. And on the whole, it could be a lot more, and there's certainly the potential for a lot more. It's held back by the evidence-based medicine movement, because there they say, well, there aren't lots of papers in peer-reviewed journals about this, and there aren't because there aren't any grants for it, and there aren't any grants for it because the people who give the grants don't want to fund it. I'm now running a campaign in Britain to try and persuade the government to take up evidence-based medicine properly and do outcome studies. That, I think, is the fairest way. I call it level playing field trials. Take a condition like lower back pain that lots of people have, or cold sores, or something like that, or migraine headaches. And then you could have, say, 1,000 people who suffer from it. Allocate them at random to different treatment modalities. Anyone who claims to be able to cure it could try. Homeopaths, acupuncturists, chiropractors, craniosacral osteopaths, naturopaths, Anyone who claims to be able to, acupuncturists, anyone who claims to be able to, physiotherapists, they could all have a go. And you just see general practitioners, just how they all turn out in comparison to the cost and the treatment, just simply the outcomes. Do people get equally better from all these? They might. Do people get better with some than others? Do the practitioners make a big difference? Rather, are they more important than the system? These kinds of outcome studies could, I think, actually tell us what we need to know, what works. Completely theory-free, completely pragmatic. And say it turned out that homeopathy worked best. Then, of course, the critics would say, well, that just proves they're getting a huge placebo effect. So, well, okay, if it's a big placebo effect, if they're getting a bigger placebo than anyone else, then that's the best treatment, if it's the most cost-effective. And so I went to a very interesting conference in London a few months ago on the placebo effect. And there were people from mainstream medical institutes who are now recognizing, yes, it's not just a nuisance in clinical trials, it's real, it's important, and it does something. There were other people from alternative medical research, there were skeptics and so on. But what became clear was that everyone agreed that the placebo effect, the body's own healing capacities, are important, and they're at work in all forms of medicine, including conventional medicine. The final panel discussion was the most interesting bit. It was entitled, "Can there be an honest placebo?" Because a placebo, if it's a blank pill, doesn't work if you know it's a blank pill. You have to think it's some wonder drug for it to work. So can there be an honest placebo? I thought it was a really good question.
Well, and there's a dishonest placebo out there right now that people buy by $1 billion a year called Prozac. Prozac, in a chemical test in a laboratory situation by the drug companies, revealed to be no better than a sugar pill in its effectiveness. And yet they just hid all that data, and it was hard to get it out that Erwin Kirsch, a psychologist at University of Connecticut, had to go through the Freedom of Information Act to get this data from the drug company and reveal that, in fact, it is no better than it's a good placebo, though.
Yes.
It's a good one. And you know why? Because, as you said, if you take a sugar pill and you don't feel anything, then it's just your belief that's, I think it's going to work. But the Prozac works really good because it has a side effect. It actually makes you tingly or something. I don't know, something like that. But the point about it, as soon as they take it, they say, oh, it's working. And as soon as they feel it, it enhances the placebo effect even farther. Yes. And the statistics are very clear. 1/3 minimum, 1/3 of all medical healing is directly attributable to the placebo effect. And that includes surgery as well as drug-related healing. Yes. So, as Rupert was mentioning, it's very important is that the drug companies are doing their level best now to identify people who react to placebos, to eliminate them from their drug so they can find a test to identify them and then take them away from the drug test, because the placebo people ruin the drug trials, because most of the drugs are no better than the placebo effect.
Yes. Well, Erwin Kirsch was actually at this conference.
He was there.
He's now moved to England, and he's at the University of Plymouth. He gave a brilliant paper. What he showed, much as what you say, in the published trials, the Prozac, the placebo was 80% as effective as the Prozac. In the unpublished trials that he got through Freedom of Information Act, it was 100% as effective.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Oh.
He managed to get the drug companies to reveal them by using the Freedom of Information Act. They weren't in the published literature. So this is very, very interesting, isn't it? And I think that the whole interest in the placebo effect is actually a way in, because everybody agrees it happens. Conventional doctors have been saying it for years. It's obvious it involves the mind. And now I think there are some quite interesting theories. I don't know if you've come across Nicholas Humphrey's theory of the evolution of the placebo effect.
No, I haven't, actually.
He's a friend of mine, a psychologist in Britain. And he's an evolutionary psychologist. So he's in other respects a skeptic, a materialist, got all the right credentials for getting on well in the scientific world. But his theory of the placebo I find very interesting. He argues that the interesting question is not why does the placebo effect happen, but why doesn't it happen most of the time? And his theory, simple and plausible though, is that not just in humans but in animals, if when you get an infection or a disease or something, if the animal throws the whole of its immune response and the whole of its healing capacities at this disease, what if another one comes along? Because you see, it takes energy and commitment of the immune system to respond in this way. But then if another disease comes along, another emergency, another injury, you've got no reserves. So he thinks what's happened is that not just us, but animals in general, have a system where the healing response is ramped down to a lower level so that it's not working at full capacity because something has to be kept in reserve for other problems that might arise. But as soon as an animal or a person knows that they're safe, they're being taken care of, that they're being protected, then there's no need for this extra, keeping this capacity in reserve, and it's disinhibited. That's the placebo effect, according to him.
It's interesting because stress hormones have been identified as the chemistry that shuts off the immune system. And as you said, it's a way of conserving energy for what's needed. So, for example, if you have a bacterial infection and you have a bad case of diarrhea, and a lion is chasing you, then you have to decide how much energy you're going to put into fighting the bacteria and how much energy to put in running away from the lion. And it turns out, I appreciate it because you don't fight the bacteria, because if you get eaten by the lion, then diarrhea is his problem at that point. But the reality has been really, so basically this is a mechanism of the system to protect you against the greatest threat. And that stress hormones are actually used by the medical profession when people get a graft of a transplanted organ or tissue. They give them the stress hormones. That shuts off the immune system and protects the rejection. Yeah, well, that's cool. That's an experimental situation. But what about all of us on our day-to-day lives? And this is what the big issue is by stressing yourself. I can tell you right now, if you start putting up the stress hormones in your system, then you are automatically beginning to shut off the immune system, because that's the trade-off. Are you afraid of the interior threat or the exterior threat? Which is greater? And of course, in our world today, Homeland Security is going to tell you every day where that threat should be. And the relevance about that is we have gotten sicker since 9/11 as an entire population because of the overall stress. And this is just wiping us out financially as a nation. Downward. And the pharmaceutical companies have made over in excess of 20% per year more profit than every preceding year. So in 5 years, they are making 100% more profit just because we've gotten weaker on this thing. And I would like to suggest something, Noah. This is an interesting possibility. That we are given a lot of instinctual abilities when we arrive here, and I would include self-healing as an instinctual ability that we got. But let me tell you about another instinctual ability, and then I'll come back to the reason why. All humans can swim the moment they're born. They can come out of the birth canal underwater. All humans can swim. It's guaranteed. Then I ask a question. Well, if that's true, then how come we have to put so much effort in teaching Johnny how to swim when he's 5 years old if he's genetically endowed already to how to swim? And the answer, then you go back and say, well, think about it this way. As Johnny was that infant, every time he got near the water, the parents threw a big fit. Oh my God, Johnny's by the pool, Johnny's by the creek, Johnny's in the bathtub, wherever Johnny. But Johnny's got it figured out, because in his learning state, he's now got it figured out. And he says, this thing, which I now recognize as water, is very dangerous. Why? Because every time I get near it, these people go crazy. And so the issue about it is, so now that Johnny believes in his heart, deep down in his knowing of experience, that water, it means death. And then you put a bathing suit on him, and you want to throw him in the water. And I know he's scrabbing like a cat with claws, he's not going to let go. Why? Because you've conditioned him for 5 years that water is going to kill him, and now you want to throw him in the water, okay? He can't swim after that. He lost it because of the fear. Now, put that into it, and so we add this back to the healing thing. We're all able to innately heal ourselves. It was a given. It was built in. People were here a million years before medical school, so there was a lot of life going on in healing before doctors were here. And the issue about it is this. Now take these people, these kids, go back into that infancy of that child, and things that we now know that actually the child is downloading memory even before it's born, so everything is being recorded. And here's the thing that finds out. Every time that child gets sick or someone in the family gets sick, what's the dialogue? Oh, we got to take Johnny to the doctor. We got to take Johnny to the doctor. Or everybody, anybody got sick goes to the doctor. This is a learning. What does it say? It builds in a consciousness program that says that if I get sick, I have to go to the doctor. Yeah, but you're already innately able to heal yourself. Not after the learning, because the learning overrides the instinct. Why? The learning of the fear of the water overrode the instinct of swimming. So what happens now is what? The belief that says that the first step in my healing is I go to the doctor. And then the innate system can start to kick in because you've accomplished step one. And the joke, if you think about it, is how many people get well on the way to the doctor? And the reason is once you start to complete that step, then you're telling the system, okay, let's go ahead with the rest of it. I did the first step. And I think that is the interference part. It's a learned consciousess override of an instinct, I think.
Yes. But then this, presumably though, the same belief step would kick in if you're going to an alternative doctor of one kind or another. There would be no difference there,
maybe
surely.
Even more so, because if you get enough people to say, I went to this practitioner, and there's enough belief behind that practitioner, then
yes.
that's an enhancer for healing as well.
Yes.
So I would certainly go along with that, yeah. And I think that's very interesting because as you're dealing with England of how to deal with this, in the U.S., we're already past 50% of the people that will go to an alternative healer before they go to a medical doctor. Why? Because of A, personal experiences, and B, the experiences of all their other friends and their family people that have gone to the same kind of healing thing. So it's propagating its own self into a greater and greater percentage. And ultimately, we'll start to learn who we really are. And I think this is a problem for me. It's interesting because I spent some time in Australia, New Zealand, and it's interesting because I'm talking about the nature of our learning overriding our abilities. In other words, you were given abilities, but your consciousness can override these abilities. And in these countries, they voice it in a way that we don't voice it, but we follow the same thing. They call it cutting the tall poppies. And what they mean by that is when you plant poppies, they all pretty much grow up to the same height. And then every now and then some poppy shoots up higher than all the other poppies. And so the resolution is anything that shoots up its head higher than all the other heads, you cut its head off. And the nature of what that represented is when a child starts to express properties that go above or beyond the average, then there's a social tendency to tear them back down, cut the tall poppy, and say, who do you think you are? And this who do you think you are to me is the most important learning kind of thing, because if you doubt yourself, then no matter how capable you are of doing things, that doubt will pull the rug out from under it. So, for example, walking across hot coals. Now, people that walk across don't have doubt about that belief generally. And I don't think that they want to entertain a doubt, because if you halfway across and then say, wonder if I can do this, then it's too late, okay? But it's interesting because those that believe they'll get burned, and those that don't believe they'll get burned will not get burned. And that's only a matter of what's the difference. It was only a difference of their belief about it. I use another example, two more that I really like about this, because it really says you are far more powerful, except your beliefs undermine who you are. And so I'll give two more examples. Just one is and many people have seen this, like a woman lifting a car up to get a child out from under the car. Well, I mean, you get good weightlifters, they're going to lift 400 pounds, that's really supreme. And here's a woman who's not athletic in any way, lifting up, not the whole car, but certainly on one side, it's got to be 1,000 pounds at some point, lifting it up to get a child out. Not that she questioned her belief about it, because there was no question. It wasn't even in her mind that it was questionable. I have to lift the car up to get the child out. So it doesn't go into doubt. You can't really pick that car up if you try to think about it and say, I wonder if I can pick this car up. That would create the problem. And the last one, we have walking across hot coals, lifting up 1,000 pounds or more. And the one that I really like, I say for last, is down south we have Pentecostal Baptists. They work themselves up in a Jesus state and of ecstasy, and they get all excited about how they're testifying that God protects them. And many of these people in this Pentecostal church down in Kentucky area and Virginia area, they play with rattlesnakes and copperheads, poisonous snakes, and in testament that God's going to protect them. Even if they get bitten, they don't really have any consequences of it. But those aren't the cool ones. The coolest ones in the group have so much faith that God will protect them, they drink toxic doses of strychnine, and they have no harmful effects. And you have to stop and say, how weak am I or how powerful am I? And the answer is, to me, it really comes down to this. Who do you think you are in your belief issue and what we've been programmed with? And for me, when I started to become aware of this, it was really essential to go back and think about your childhood experiences where you were told all the things you couldn't do. And who do you think you are kind of things, and you don't deserve things. Well, every time those were implanted, those became programs that interfere with the unfolding of the system, and this consciousness can redirect the programming. So, yeah.
Yes. Well, I agree, and I think that the importance of belief, which you point out very clearly and strongly, is just one aspect of the bigger question of the power of the mind and the nature of the mind. This is really the biggest unsolved question in science, and for years scientists simply ignored consciousness. It doesn't appear in physics and chemistry textbooks, and so biologists, thinking that all life could be reduced to physics and chemistry, ignored it too. Psychologists in much of the 20th century tried to pretend it didn't exist in behaviorism and similar academic disciplines. But now it's really firmly on the agenda, and what's so interesting is that the debates that happen, for example, in the Journal of Consciousness Studies or in Brain and Behavioral Sciences, have now more or less blown apart the naive materialism, nothing but the activity of the nerves. As soon as you start asking those questions and start looking at the details, it gets much more complicated, and simple answers don't work. And no one knows the answer, but the debate is opening up, and I think this is one of the most exciting areas of science at the moment. I hope to say something about it tomorrow. But I don't know if you follow the consciousness studies literature much, or is this an area?
Well, it depends on what level you're talking about. If it's the one where I have to read the papers by taking a dictionary out and deciphering all their words, I don't read a lot of those.
No.
But I have been following on, so
yes.
Lead me into where we're going with it.
The other area that we don't have time to talk about really, but the other area that I think is really exciting is the way in which biological research is revealing that inheritance works in different ways from the standard DNA in inheritance pattern. I know you're interested in this in epigenetics. I've been interested in recent research that shows that plants undergo mutations at vastly increased rates when under certain conditions in ways that ought not to happen. Bacteria undergo, they produce mutations they need when they're needed at far above the chance levels. More and more of this evidence is piling up, showing that the whole genetic system is no longer simple, just copies of DNA. There's much, much more going on. It's much more complicated and much more interesting.
Well, yeah, and here comes the catch, though, for all this, because we want to do all this research. And yet, what has been very clearly demonstrated, and I think there's so many wonderful articles about this, is that as physicists have told us that the observer gets involved with creating the reality. And the science has now revealed very clearly that the experimenter's consciousness totally is involved with the outcome of these experiments. So the concept of the idea in the old days of, it's just all free experiments, now all of that has to be reconsidered in the context that the observer is altering the outcome of these experiments. And there's a lot of wonderful studies. I love one. Some people may have heard of Cleve Baxter. And he had shown that, for example, that if you take some brine shrimp and take them from a beaker where there's a big colony of them, and then take a small sample and take that small sample and stick it in distilled water, that causes these brine shrimp to blow up. I mean, for brine shrimp, agonizing situation. What he noticed is that when he dumped the little aliquot into the distilled water and those Artemia were beginning to die, that in the original colony that he took them from, there was tremendous activity and turmoil going on at the exact moment that the other ones were dying. So he's saying, oh my goodness, these colonies are connected. And I read about all that. That was pretty neat. But I read a paper that came out from 3 young guys who were working in an official biology laboratory with chemicals and all that kind of stuff like that. And they read that and they said, but we're growing brine shrimp. Let's just try this. And it was neat because they set up just like Cleve did the experiment. And every time they threw that little aliquot into distilled water, the original colony went crazy. And they got so excited, they said, now let's do this, write it up for publication. Well, now that science got into it, they said, well, to make it more regular and, more, repeatable, let's set it up so a computer runs it. And so the computer would take the aliquot out at a certain time, dump it into the distilled water, and then the machine would read the turmoil. The moment they put it on a computer, the experiments no longer worked. And it was published that they worked when they did it, but not when the computer did it. And so then you take that, and it's interesting because in the British Medical Journal, there was a series of articles about how the pharmaceutical industry is involved with the research, and what they found out was that when the same research is carried out by independent funds versus funds from the pharmaceutical company, that when it came from the pharmaceutical company, 4 to 5 times more likely to get results that supported their interest. And they weren't cheating, but they went into the issue with a total consciousness belief that they were believing what they wanted to see. And so to me, it's a real correction factor I think we have to bring back in, that we are not separate from our experiments and that we are contributing to the outcome.
Well, let me just say one more thing. I think we should open this up for questions. One point on this, I published a study recently on how objective is regular science. If you look at, we know that in medicine they make a big thing about the importance of double-blind conditions. If the patient and the doctor know which pill is the placebo and which is the real one, it doesn't work. So you have to do those under blind conditions. In psychology, people do blind experiments because the expectations of the psychologist can affect the results. This is well established in medicine and psychology. I wanted to find out how much normal scientists are aware of the possibility of bias in their experiments. Is the fact that science is based on consensus because it's about objectively real reality, or is it because scientists themselves, by reaching a consensus, tend to produce similar results? And I did a series that looked at the top papers in physics, chemistry, and biology journals. In physics and chemistry journals, the percentage that involved blind techniques, not knowing which sample you're looking at, was 0. In biology, it was 0.4. In psychology, it was 10%. In medicine, it was 25%. It's only 25% even in the New England Journal of Medicine, Annals of Internal Medicine, and so forth. In parapsychology, it was 85%. So what this revealed to me is that the vast majority of science that we have going on at the moment is unprotected science. And there's the possibility of biases from the scientists, the observers, the intentions, their expectations is huge. I tried to persuade some scientists to do experiments of regular lab classes where students were given the usual biochemistry experiment, for example, activated enzyme, normal enzyme. I said half the class should do it where they're just labeled A and B, do it blind, and see if they get the same results as the students who are being trained as scientists of the future to get the expected results. Any scientist who's working in a lab has been trained for years to get the expected results through lab classes. But I haven't been able to persuade a single scientist to do this in the laboratory. I published this paper in the Skeptical Inquirer under the title, Could Experimental Effects Occur in the Physical and Biological Sciences? Asking card-carrying skeptics to carry out this crucial test because they claim to be interested in the objectivity of science. Not one came forward. I talked to a school teacher and head of science in a British school and tried to persuade him to do it because one of his assistants was keen to do it. And he said, this experiment will open up a can of worms. He said, of course people are going to get the expected results. That's what these lab classes are all about. And he said, and it's going to open up a can of worms, and I don't want it opened up in my school. And so, anyway, maybe we should hear from some others.
I think that might be a good idea. So I think what we'll do, ladies and gentlemen, is if you have a question that you'd like to ask either Rupert or Bruce, if you'd like to come up to the front here, what we'll do is we'll have people on both sides, and we'll take a question from one side, and then we'll take a question from the other side. We are being taped this evening, so what I'm going to ask you to do is when you speak, speak right into the mic so that we get you loud and clear. And Bruce, I'm going to ask you to
move it up.
Yeah, please. Let's go ladies first.
Okay, thanks. I drove up here from Portland, Oregon, just to ask you this question. So regarding inheritance pattern, I just got your book, Presence of the Past. I haven't started to read it. I wish I would have before I came. I'm a shamanic healing practitioner and a psychotherapist and an advanced psyche practitioner, and actually took my first training with you, Bruce. And when I use psyche, I have suffering beings and dead people come forward for help, and also what appears to be ancestral curses that are, the farthest back I've been taken is to the 1400s, that are showing up in patterns in a marriage today. And I'm wondering about how this can be explained from a scientific perspective. Because my clients say to me, what is going on? And feel freaked out.
So who's your question to?
Both, either.
Yeah. What's IK mean?
Psyche,
Oh, psyche.
psychology,
And energy
kinesiology.
Oh, I see, right.
Mm-hmm.
What do you want to start?
Okay. Well, then now here comes a leap. And the leap is that when I started to understand the nature of the cell membrane as the brain, I also realized that all of us share the same cells, live in the same environment. We have different lives and different experiences. So it's not just cells in an environment. There's something personal to ourselves. And I started to identify on the nature of our cell membranes. There are antennas, protein antennas that are reading the field. That there's a different set of antennas on your cells than anybody else's cells in the world. And this is why we can't transplant tissue from one person to another, because the antennas are identity. And some of them are called self-receptors, which receivers of self. When I started understanding, I realized that the field was playing into the biology. I also recognized, of course, that the biology was playing back into the field. It's a two-way street. And so to take it to a level that even is like practical level for me, it was when I understood that I had an identity outside of myself that was there and independent of my biology because it was a field, and whether my cells are here or not, that field is there. And I started to realize that if my identity is out there and it plays through my receptors and it plays into my body, and then I have these dual existence. I have a physical part of my life and I have a non-physical part of my life. And when I started to realize that, it's interesting because I asked my cells a question, and I realize now they're Jewish cells because I asked them a question, they answered with a question.
I'm Jewish, Bruce, be careful.
So I asked my cells, well, if I have an outside there and an inside life here, why both? And the answer came out so clear at that moment. My cells just said, Bruce, if you were just a spiritual existence, what does chocolate taste like? If you're just a spiritual entity, what does a sunset look like? Or what does being in love feel like? And I realized, oh my goodness, there's this exchange. I get into this body and I can sense the world and I can experience it. But it's not just here. My experiencing, sensing is out here. I'm not in here, I'm out here. So that when I live a life, I am changing my source through my life as well. So it's a two-way street. So I think that we put information in the field, and once it's in the field, it's in the field. And that the next time an identity comes back with the same set of receptors, that individual is coming back in again at some point. That's my take on it. But it really accounts for the fact that I see that there's an identity for us that is picked up by these antennas that is not a material identity and it's something from the field. So it would speak to an ongoing identity that's out there and that's changeable by our personal experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, I don't know how that fits.
A slightly different take I'd have. I think that we all tune into a kind of collective memory through morphic resonance. And I'll be saying more about this tomorrow morning. The collective memory into which we tune includes all people, but above all it includes people who are most like us. So members of our family, past generations, are particularly important in this memory that works through through morphic resonance. This works through the field. It's based on similarity. It works through the morphic fields of the brain and the body. And in principle, things that have happened in past generations can affect what happens now. In fact, in animals, most of their instincts are habits inherited through morphic resonance. The shape of the body through the morphic fields is inherited through morphic resonance. This is a form of inheritance that depends on genes making the right proteins, but it goes way beyond what genes can do. Now, whether or not a curse or a pattern in a family could work over so many generations is, to my mind, simply an empirical question. I mean, I haven't looked at the cases that you're referring to, so I can't answer the question specifically. But in principle, there's a way in which memories can work across generations, and normally in the form of collective memories. So, yes, I mean, inheritance involves much more than genes. I think genes are grossly overrated, in fact. The inheritance and morphic resonance, I think, is that part of it which gives rise to the organization of form, behavior, and instinct, which is inherited directly by this influence from the past. For those who are not familiar with the idea, it may sound totally obscure, but I'll try and make it a bit clearer tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question about that? When you're talking about the morphic resonances as a collective, can it be composed of individual, like, you know, in a parallel sense, like cells make up a body? Can morphic resonance be made up of smaller, units of individualized morphic resonance?
Well, if you have influence from many people in the past, you get a kind of blur, a superimposition. But morphic resonance is based on morphic fields which are organized in nested hierarchies. So you'd have resonance to do with particular small patterns, you'd have the bigger patterns. There's every level of organization would have morphic resonance involved. So I don't think that that cultural inheritance depends on sort of atomistic memes like genes. Yeah. I think it depends on there's smaller and there's bigger patterns. All of these can be
well, cultural, but that's automatically, by saying that, you've already included a large
yes.
population.
Yes.
But I was just wondering if individual resonances collectively could make a cultural reference.
Well, that's how the cultural ones come about, from individual contributions. But if you had, say, in the morphic resonance underlying the English language and the ability of babies to learn it, we've all contributed to it by speaking it. We're all contributing. I mean, you and I speak differently, so does everyone in this room. But when you put it all together in the morphic resonance, you get a kind of generic English language characteristics that we all inherit when we learn English. We each contribute to it. Some of us may even contribute new words, but the language as a whole is a composite from many individuals. They all contribute. But all the people who speak English have to be individuals. I mean, there is no sort of nebulous cultural English speaker that is beyond individuals, but we're all part of this field.
Yeah, Sam Buck, San Juan Islands. So two things. One, Bruce, and when I loved it when people would, in your field, that you were a heretic, basically, yes. Because they're putting all the rules here, and they're saying the rules that don't really fit we'll put on the shelf, right? And you're just saying, yeah, but you can't really do that because they're here. And so it's the same thing, I think, with miracles that happen. I've listened to tape or Larry Dossey, and he refers to some things that have happened to people who were like in a body cast because they had bone cancer so bad they couldn't support themselves, and then they go to a place to have a miracle to see if it would happen, and it does, and lo and behold, their body is back. So it's the same kind of thing that happens. It gets put on a shelf and called a miracle, rather than it was actually a physical thing that happened. And so I'm wondering about that, and if you could just comment on it. And then the other is the medium that you talk about in the morphic field, when the dogs know when their owners are coming home, that kind of thing. Have you tried to describe actually what that medium is? I mean, is there some, because obviously it happens, we're in this physical world, it's a physical thing that happens, so it's not I don't even think of it, I'm not sure even what the edge of spirit is and physicalness, because we're here and it happens. So I just was curious about that.
Well, let me go first. The medium of morphic fields and how they work is what I'm going to talk about tomorrow morning. So I'd rather not, to explain it properly would take me quite a while. And so I'd rather defer that. I mean, I realize you may not be here.
No, I will be here.
You will be?
Thanks.
Okay, well then, can I just defer that till tomorrow morning? Because that's one of the things I'm planning to talk about.
In my particular case, when it gets down to the concept of miracle, I find that is one of those scientific exceptions, but there's a scientific foundation for all of it. And that our issue is when things get out of the box and it's not in the standard belief system, then what we do is ignore it and call it metaphysical, spiritual, whatever it is, just to get it out of the discussion. We don't want to talk about it. But the problem, as you brought up, is that there's so much of this going on in medicine all the time. There's a point where we actually have to stop and we have to start owning that there's real events going on here where people change their beliefs or attitudes and then have profound physiological changes, cellular changes immediately upon doing that. And the issue is, it really gets down to the stuff that both Rupert and I have been talking about for years, except that it's not in the drug-related industry because they don't have that miracle drug, and therefore, and it can't be done with a drug, so they don't even, it's just not, let's don't talk about it. And science has inevitably taken things that we call these exceptions and taken them out of the picture because it muddies the water for something that they have such strong belief in that they can't change the belief. So it's interesting. We know that the whole gene theory is completely flattened. It doesn't work this way. Yeah, but the media is still going on, still looking for genes. People are getting grants to look for genes that control things, and it doesn't even exist this way anymore. So for me, it's just sort of business as usual, keep the process going, and if you get enough people to believe in something like Prozac, then it'll work, and basically it's just a manipulation, and it's an unfortunate situation because it disempowers us by telling us that we do have that we don't have these abilities. That only that rare miracle exception can show that. And to me, that is the biggest problem we have, because then it just says there are no powers, we're victims, and that's what they want us to be. And I'm very upset by that, because the whole idea is to return power back to every one of us, to walk across the fire and drink the poison. Those aren't miracles, those are people exercising power. And so that's what we're looking at.
Thank you.
I hate to do this, but we're pretty well...
No, we got a couple more.
Do we? Okay. Okay. Carry on.
Dr. Sheldrake, you were talking about the memory. No, you were talking about the dead cells that exist in vegetation and indeed in the human body, correct?
Yes.
Now, my question to you is predominantly to the vegetation species. If they're predominantly made up of dead cells, correct?
Well, the wood is made of dead cells,
okay.
Yes.
Now, is that dead wood or live wood?
Well,
I just need to qualify this, sorry, because I need to just follow my own train of thought here. If the cell is dead, how do you qualify dead? And indeed, is there memory that it is expiring, that this tree can live for over thousands of years?
Okay, one of the things that's become very clear in modern biology is that a lot of cells commit suicide. It's called apoptosis. And in the development of a plant, the cells that conduct water, the xylem cells, are dead empty tubes. It's just got a cellulose wall, there's no nucleus, no cytoplasm. As the cell becomes a wood cell, it thickens up the wall, and then it dissolves itself. And these are indeed dead cells. And most of the wood that makes the beams that are holding up the ceiling here, and wood on floors and pencils in trees and so on, most of those are dead cells. But there is, between the wood, there are what are called rays. They're called medullary rays, which are living cells that go, if you look at the wood and the grain of the wood, you have the annual rings, but you have things that radiate out from the center called medullary rays, which are made up of living cells that help keep the interior of the trunk protected and alive, except the very heart, the heartwood, where everything's dead. Then the bark, between the bark and the wood is an area of intensely living cells dividing that produce new cells, which is why tree trunks get thicker as they get older. And they produce new bark cells. So, but there are a lot of these dead cells, and most of the wood that we use as structural material is dead cells.
All right, so then in the human body, are we indeed inheriting the wisdom of that cell as it expires?
Well, I think as these cells expire, they have a...
Because we also then have the option to be a different human being in every single moment.
Well, a lot of our cells expire all the time. They're turning over all the time. The intestinal lining,
Right.
all the cells on your skin are dead, or at least on the outside of the skin. The red blood cells have lost their nucleus, and they only live about 120 days. So brain and muscle cells live much longer, but most cells of our body are actually dying and being replaced by new ones from stem cells.
Right.
So this is a normal process. Cell death is a normal part of life in
Yeah.
plants and in
Yeah.
animals.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more?
2 or 3, I would say, if they're short. Because it's only 5 feet.
I also drove from Portland to ask you these questions, but you guys are popular in Portland. So I'll kind of couch my question in something that Dr. Lipton said, which is the power of doubt. And so it seems to me that in the way science has progressed, and it's just where we've been in the stage of our culture, we have assumed away the energetic experiences, and we've focused on the things that we could make advances in understanding in. Now we're in a period of overshoot where our theories ourselves are kind of shackles, and then the people who are most focused on this think those of us who are thinking outside of that box are crazy. And so some of what we need to do is have a new model. And the question to me is in terms of, if you think about doubt, could we progress to a place where we're thinking about what is the physics and the structure of doubt? And is that an energetic state that exists in a person that can be diagnosed or can be intervened with, and not necessarily pharmaceutical, but in some other sort of a way? And so coming at the problem in a completely different way, and the way where I think it's interesting to have the two of you together is morphogenic fields. You said something that was the second part of my question, which is that they're in nested hierarchies. Because my question was, if you think of the relationship between data and metadata, so what is the metamorphogenic field? What is the thing what is the binding structure? And maybe you're going to get into this tomorrow because that's related to the medium. But it seems to me it is within there that we can understand a structure for doubt or for other conditions, energetic conditions within the human experience, that if we can model and study, we might be able to really unlock this. It's not just for people who can get themselves. I like to use Madonna as an example. She wasn't a great singer, but she was incredibly successful because she was very driven, and she just thought, I can do this. Same way, if I think I'm not going to get bitten, I'm not going to die by being bit by the snake, I don't get bit. So the nub of my question, bringing it all together, is, do you think morphogenetic fields are time-based? Are they limited in the same way that biology is, or is there a timelessness to them?
Well, there's 3 questions here, really. Morphogenetic fields have a kind of memory. In that sense, they're time-based. They're based on what's happened in the past. They're in a nested hierarchy because what they organize is in a nested hierarchy. In cells, there are organelles. In organelles, there are molecules. The cells are in tissues. The tissues are in organs. The organs are in organisms. The organisms are in societies. Each of those levels has an organizing field, a morphic field. So the individuals within a society are organized by the societal field, which acts on individuals. Individual fields act on organs. Organ fields act on tissues. Tissue fields on cells. cells on organelles and organelles on molecules and molecules on atoms. At each level there's a field organizing the whole. Each part is part of a larger whole, but it's also a whole itself made up of parts. That's the way the whole of nature is organized. No, it's true of subatomic particles in atoms, in molecules, in crystals, planets, in solar systems, in galaxies, in galactic clusters. Nature is made up of many levels, and the higher levels include the lower ones. It's not arbitrary. They're larger systems that include, like those addresses some of us wrote as children. You know, when I wrote them at home, Newark-on-Trent, Nottinghamshire, England, the United Kingdom, Europe, the world, the solar system, the universe, etc. We're always part of larger systems. When it comes to doubt, I think all of us are in favor of doubt if it means people having doubts about things we don't believe in ourselves. I mean, one of the problems both Bruce and I have is dealing with dogmatic scientists who have no doubt at all that their sort of molecular reductionism is going to reveal the secret of life. They've been saying this for decades. They still do. They used to say, give us 10 years. Now then they said, give us 20, and now they still say, give us 20. I mean, it's always somewhere in the future. It's what Sir Karl Popper called promissory materialism, issuing promissory notes against future explanations. And there's a situation where I think more doubt would actually be a good thing. So it's a matter of getting the right balance. And I think that doubt involves an ambiguity. It involves what could go one way, it could go another. In quantum theory, it'd be called superposition. You've got two possibilities or two or more possibilities superimposed, and it could go one way or another. Most of our consciousness is concerned with ambiguity, and most of our conscious life is to do with choosing among possibilities. If we were absolutely certain all the time about everything, we wouldn't really need to exercise our minds at all. But I think when it comes to getting better, this faith that you're going to get better, you're going to be safe, you're going to be secure, does enhance the healing process. And having that kind of faith is reasonable if you feel secure and you're not undermining it by needless doubts. So it's a dialectic of doubt and certainty. And there's far too much certainty in the world at the moment, I find, in certain quarters. I have to deal with these extremely dogmatic skeptics like Richard Dawkins, and these people are absolutely certain they're right. These dogmatic atheists who are on the rampage at the moment are absolutely convinced they're right. They're absolutely certain that what they believe is true. They attack other people's beliefs. What they don't do is look at their own, and I think more doubt would be a very good thing in some cases.
Gentlemen, I think will we take one more?
One. At least one.
Okay.
If they're short ones.
If they're short ones. Can we make them short and just really get to the question?
With regards
Thanks.
With regards to the baby that was taught it can't swim,
Yes.
how do I identify those thousands of I can't swims in my life? And then more importantly, how do I get rid of them?
Okay, good question. I'll try and make it short because that's a special part of tomorrow's program, because there's this issue that I'm really going to talk about where we believe that we're running our lives with our conscious beliefs and our desires and our wants and our wishes, that when it doesn't work out, then we always look around and say, well, it can't be my fault because these are all the wonderful things that I want. And it turns out that 95% of our life is coming from unconscious programming. Only about 5% is coming from the conscious mind. And so the relevance about that is if you're unaware of the programs in the subconscious mind, then you're unaware of 95% of what's going on in your life. And this is the critical part. So now the question is, how do you talk to the subconscious mind to find out what's in there? And here comes the hard part. There's no entity in the subconscious mind. And this is biggest failure as far as I can see, is because people keep talking like, come on, wake up, fix it, do it right, and they get mad at themselves because they keep talking and they still play the same behaviors again. And if you really look at it, what appears to be going on here is that the subconscious mind is equivalent of a tape player. It learns an experience, and then you push the button, and it plays the tape. And people even say, "Oh, that guy pushed my buttons," and then all of a sudden, this behavior came out of me. Well, the important understanding about this tape player is that it is a tape player, but there's nobody in the tape player. So the idea, if you want to change a program in a tape player, don't go up and talk to the tape player, because it's not going to do it. There's a process, and you can push a record button. And in some of these new energy psychologies, lots of modalities, all different kinds. On my website, look under resources, energy psychology. Many of them use what's called kinesiology, and very quickly why that's important is it's muscle testing. What is muscle testing? And the fact is this, is you make a statement with your conscious mind, and if it turns out to be in harmony with the program that already exists in the subconscious mind, then both minds agree and there's harmony and there's strength in the system. But if you make a statement with your conscious mind and the subconscious mind doesn't agree with that statement, that it has a different program in there, that causes a disharmony in the system, which is reflected as weakening of the muscles, not just any like arm muscles, every muscle in your body. So a syntonic optometrist can have you look at an eye chart, and let's say you're reading line 6, and then you get real irritated all of a sudden. You might have to go up 2 lines because all of a sudden your eye muscles will get weak. But when there's a lot of harmony in the system, then you actually can read down a few extra lines. So the issue is this. There's nobody in there. How do you find out what's going on? And the answer is you bring up questions with the conscious mind, and if the subconscious mind agrees with those, then you get a harmony response. And if it doesn't agree, you get a weakening of the muscle, a disharmony response. And before everybody goes and do this, as Dr. Sheldrake talks about, there's also interfering fields. Very critical part. If the person that is pressing on your arm is involved with the outcome, the answer to the test, then they distort the test by quantum entanglement. This is, Amit Goswami talks about some of this, and it's really important to understand that. So it's a good assay, but it's fraught with some entanglement issues, so you don't get always perfect answers. So I just want to throw that out. It's not 100% anything. Yes, how do you find out what's in there? Challenge it with a question and see if the subconscious mind is in harmony or disharmony by what happens with that. And we can change it. Just go to the resources on my website and look for energy psychology modalities.
To poorly paraphrase Buckminster Fuller, you can't improve upon an existing paradigm. You have to create a whole new one. First, more than anything, I want to acknowledge those of you like yourself that are creating a paradigm in which science, spirituality, belief can all come together, and I tell you, it's like I can't stop getting this, and it's just so exciting. So as a chiropractor, number one, thank you for what you're doing in my field. My question really is, number one, is as a person in the healing field, really do I have any more responsibility other than to inspire and uplift another and to change their belief? Because that is the driving force. And number two is, where does self and other stop? If a person I'm influencing you, to what degree do I have a power over you? And to what degree does the priority of what you believe, what you think, what you affect, counter-ride whatever is in the field or in other beliefs or in others' words? So it's that self-other distancing. So if you could just comment on that.
Well, oh yeah, the answers to life. Basically, it comes back to entanglement. Okay. And the idea is everybody's entangled in the field, and yet you can block your field just as much as the people can block the heat from the hot coals from burning them or the strychnine from affecting their field. And they can allow you in if they're looking for a healing and they find you to be the healer, then that will facilitate that. And it's real interesting because a lot of chiropractors have really put their effort on the adjustment, the mechanical part, but it really turns out it's your heart and your intention and your desire to heal. When you're putting hands on people, that is the healing part. So it really is a dynamic between you and the patient, how much they want to get healed, how much their subconscious is going to allow them to go there. That's another critical part. A lot of people do not want to get healed for a very simple reason. When they were young, that is when they got most of their love. And so as they're getting older, their subconscious says, well, how am I going to get some of that love? And the answer was, go back to the program, and it says get sick. And that's very difficult to heal somebody who is winning from being sick. So it's not as simple just because somebody says they want to get healed, it's going to work.
Thank you guys for changing it so much, really.
Thank you.